I really wanted to draw attention to the fact that clinical trials are a valid treatment option for some people. And a few people have said to me over my 10 years here at Beacon, well, I was interested in a clinical trial, but my doctor said, don't worry about it, I still have things for you to do. And other people have said, I'm really worried, my doctor thinks I should go into a clinical trial. They don't have anything left for me. Where's my hope? And I think it's important to recognize that clinical trials are something that you can participate in fully before you get to that point of you have no other options, and you're helping science. They're also the kind of thing where you're going to get really good monitoring, and while they can be very scary, people are watching, and there is the opportunity, and I know that our speakers are going to let you know more about clinical trials. There's always the chance that you can get out, you can withdraw from that clinical trial. And I encourage our speakers to remember always that people that do go into a clinical trial are donating their bodies to science. They're helping advance your knowledge and the knowledge of everybody. And it's always wonderful when you can give it back and let them know what you learned, and making sure that it's in patient-friendly language, because they're not all scientists. Some of them are, but not all of them. So I'm really delighted that we're here. Clinical trials can be a very effective way to find an answer to the bladder cancer conundrum that many people are in and help us advance the science. And I'm excited because we have two speakers. First one I'm going to introduce is all the way on my left. Kendall Lewis is a senior clinical research coordinator at the James Cancer Center here at The Ohio State. She helps patients every day as they explore and take part in bladder cancer studies. So it's a really interesting job because you probably have more than one that you're working on. Yeah. So she's a true advocate for making sure patient voices are heard, because without you, science doesn't happen. And then Dr. Katharine Collier is a medical oncologist and assistant professor of internal medicine at Ohio State. Her research focuses on finding ways to personalize treatment for urinary cancers and improve patient outcomes. Together, they're going to take you behind the scenes, help you understand a little of the magic that goes on. This is not your science class from high school. This is real work, real science. And in the last 20 years of Beacon, because of clinical trials, we owe a great gratitude, to all of the people that are behind the scenes making the science happen. It just doesn't happen by itself. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie, for that great introduction. I'm Kate, and this is Kendall. We'll introduce ourselves a little bit on an upcoming slide here, but we're going to try to tackle a fairly large topic in the next session here about clinical trials. And so hopefully we can provide some clarity and information for what can be sometimes a very confusing or overwhelming topic. So we'll do our best. So first, neither of us have a conflict of interest. A little bit more about myself. So you already heard I'm a medical oncologist at Ohio State. I treat all genitourinary cancers, but I have a particular focus in treating urothelial cancer, so bladder and upper tract cancers. I also run a research program focused just on urothelial carcinomas. I have a little added formal training in clinical trial design as well.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kendall Lewis. I work for The Ohio State University. I work for the genital urinary oncology team, so I work with Dr. Collier and Dr. Pohari, who you heard from earlier. We focus on clinical trials in that area, so bladder, kidney, prostate, testicular. We do them all, and then my specific focus is on muscle invasive and non-muscle invasive bladder cancer.
And so a little outline of what we're going to try to cover here in the next 30 or 40 minutes, and then leave a lot of time for questions, is we're going to talk a little bit about the general types of clinical trials and a little bit about the design, mainly to communicate that it can get complicated and that each trial is different, but we're going to try to touch at least on a few points that Kendall and I have both found that can be confusing for patients when they're considering or looking for clinical trial options. I'm going to try to give an overview of all the types of people that are involved in clinical trials. There's the people that you see when you're on a clinical trial or in the office of your oncologist, urologist, but there are many, many people behind clinical trials before they even open and let patients on, and people that are watching them from behind the scenes the whole time. So I'll try to give some introduction to all of the people involved. And then I'll end my part talking a little bit about why you might want to consider a clinical trial and why I will offer clinical trials to my patients or bring them up in different situations, and things that I think about from my perspective as an oncologist in talking to my patients about trials. And then the second half, Kendall will walk through a lot of the nitty-gritty logistics and all of the steps and visits involved in a clinical trial, because it does add a few steps if you are on a clinical trial, and that can be confusing. So I just want to take a step back and put clinical trials in the context of clinical research in general. So when we talk about clinical research, it's really research that involves patients in any way. And there's many types of clinical research. I break down at the bottom of this slide here 2 main categories that as a patient you might hear about or be approached to consider participating in. And I just break it into 2 general categories. One are something we call observational studies, which is not the focus of what we're talking about today, but are very common. And these tend to be studies where they're looking to follow a group of patients, potentially with cancer or bladder cancer, and see over time how they do. Potentially these are studies that just want to collect samples every so often, or let's say, if you were getting blood drawn, the leftover blood to go do studies on. Those are observational studies. There's many of those out there. We're not going to focus on those so much today. What we're going to talk more about and focus our talk is on interventional clinical trials. So these are most often studying either a new drug or a new combination of drugs we already know about, or new ways of giving a drug that we already know about or is already potentially approved in a different disease or a different setting for bladder cancer. Similar to these, there are also clinical trials that involve devices or new procedures or surgeries. Sometimes there are interventional clinical trials that have a dietary change, for example, to adhere to a certain diet, or even a certain exercise regimen. Those follow a lot of the same principles, but a lot of the details we'll talk about is more focused on trials that are studying a drug. And so when we think about how new drugs come out and how they get developed from the very beginning until the point that they're approved in the US by the FDA and become available for patients, they follow a long road that takes years. And so on the far left, you'll see this is very basic science. This is often when scientists or biologists or chemists are trying to come up with a new drug to treat any disease. They'll be working very much on the molecular level. They're trying to come up with a compound or a molecule that will target a certain other molecule that will, in the case of our topic, kill bladder cancer cells. And so that takes many, many years. Those, when they find a drug or a molecule that they think is going to work and they want to study it more, the next big step is that it goes to something called preclinical studies. So this is basically when a new drug gets tested in cells and dishes. So in our case, it's often bladder cancer cells. being grown in a dish to see if just putting that drug on there can kill the cancer cells in a dish. Next, it often gets tested in animals. Almost all the drugs now that are in clinical trials were tested in animals previously, because particularly when we have a new compound, we have to make sure that they are safe before they get tested in any human being. And so most drugs will get tested in animals next, sometimes a couple types of animals. And here they want to make sure they're safe. They also want to make sure that it still looks like in animals that these drugs work to kill, in our case, bladder cancer type cells. So once all these years of work have been done, and they try compounds, sometimes they get it to animals and it doesn't work, so then it ends there and they go back to the drawing board. But if they've gotten through this far, all these years of work, and it looks promising, that's when we start considering clinical trials. And clinical trials refer to testing medications in people. And we'll go over the different phases of these on the next slide, but the point of clinical trials, which are very, very highly regulated and controlled, is that they want to make sure that these drugs are safe if it's a new drug, or if we're combining two drugs we already know are safe in humans, is the combination safe? And so we do this in a very controlled manner, as you'll see. Once a drug makes it through clinical trials, so that's usually they'll do a phase 1, then a phase 2, and a phase 3. Every so often they'll combine those into one study, but phase 1 and 2 are sometimes combined. But once we get through a phase 3 study, and if it shows that it's working and it's safe, that's when the FDA, at the end of the phase 3 study, will approve the drug. And then that becomes available to all patients in our country. Okay. So if we just focus in step 3 here for the rest of our talk, I break down here a little bit of the difference between phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. I'm not sure if that's projecting well enough to see, but I'll talk through the high points. So phase 1 trials happen first. They're the smallest of the phases of trials. They can have anywhere between 20, 25 patients up to usually about 100. The main point of a phase 1 trial is to make sure very carefully that a drug is safe. So patients are watched very, very closely on phase 1 trials. This usually involves extra blood work compared to some of the other phases of trials. Looking for what exactly the drug is doing on all sorts of different levels in people, and measuring a lot of things to make sure that it's safe. There's also extra blood samples a lot of times to measure the drug level in the blood. And there's we'll go over on the next slide, there's lots of different ways that they figure out what dose to give, and then they start really, really low, knowing that this is almost certainly a safe dose, and then they gradually increase it, because usually we think for most drug types is a bit of a generalization, but that you want to find a dose that's high enough that's effective, but low enough that it's safe and not causing side effects. So that's there's a lot of dose levels in phase 1 trials. If a phase 1 trial is complete and the conclusion is that this drug is safe, people didn't have too many side effects from it, and maybe in this small group of people there may or may not have already been a signal that it's working for the cancer, then the drug will move on to a phase 2 trial, which is a bigger trial so that you have more people and more able from the statistics and the math to be able to tell whether or not this drug looks like it's working to treat, in our case, bladder cancer. There's several different ways these trials can be set up too. Sometimes everyone in the trial is getting the same drug, and sometimes these are randomized, and we'll talk about what that means. And then if a drug goes through a phase 2 trial, and if that is deemed successful, which would mean that it both still looks safe in the more patients that have gotten it, and it also shows by some measures that it's effective, meaning that it helps treat the bladder cancer effectively. A lot of times this will be measured in something called progression-free survival. Then it'll go to an even bigger study, usually of hundreds, sometimes thousands of patients. A lot of times these phase 3 studies are open in multiple countries, and they're international studies. And these are almost always randomized, which we'll talk about, where they're comparing this new drug or regimen to what patients in that exact situation would normally get as what we would call standard of care. And the point is to see, is this new thing that we're testing better than what everyone else is getting right now? Because that's a huge advancement then, if we can prove it's better than what everyone else is getting. And that often means that in the case of bladder cancer, that it helps people live significantly longer. And if that is a successful, positive phase 3 trial for survival benefit, that will almost certainly lead to a new approval for that drug in that disease for patients just like those that were on the trial.
Can I just interrupt 1 second, Dr. Collier, because you brought up an important point. You mentioned that randomization, you could be put into the trial for the new investigational medicine, or you would get standard of care. So in cancer clinical trials, they're not like science from high school where you knew there was a placebo, right? People don't get a pink sugar pill in cancer clinical trials usually.
Correct. So, and we'll touch on this again in a slide or two, the concept of placebo. But this is one thing I think that there's some, I don't know, myth out there, I guess. But it's rare in clinical trials for cancer these days for there to be placebo. It would only come up if it was a situation in which right now patients would not get a treatment. Let me give an example there. So a few years ago, for example, before we had what we call adjuvant immunotherapy, so like after cystectomy for muscle-invasive bladder cancer, now there's approval for immunotherapy. But, you know, I lose track of time a little bit, probably 3-4 years ago, we didn't have that approval yet. So at that point, the standard of care was for people after surgery to just be watched. When they started studying immunotherapy after surgery, since the standard of care was just to observe people, some of the studies back then did have an arm that was placebo, but it's a very specific situation, right? So in that situation, patients were either getting randomized to getting immunotherapy, which they were trying to study, versus what we were already doing anyway, was just watching people. And so sometimes those patients would be given placebo just so we didn't all have the bias of who's getting the drug and who's not. So it's very rare to have any placebo in cancer studies now, but even when it is, and this is something that is highly scrutinized by all the people that approve trials before they even start, is it appropriate and ethical to be having somebody get placebo? And so it would never make it through regulatory approvals, and we would never open it, and no doctor would recommend a study where you are withholding treatment from people to give them placebo. That's incredibly unethical and does not happen. And that's a part of all of the people you're going to see that approve trials and review them to make sure they're ethical, is specifically on the point of placebo. It's a great question. And we'll see that in 2 slides. But before I get to it, I just want to give some idea here of a little bit of how complicated some of these trial designs can be, and why sometimes it may seem a little bit confusing, and that is because they are complicated structure, and so they're different for every trial too. And so these can be very specific to the trial you're considering, and that's when your physician, and very, very much so clinical trial coordinators that know the trials very well, can help walk you through this. But I have a couple of things I want to point out here. So what you see here are just different schema of how they pick doses for phase 1 trials. And so the main point is that these are 4 different ways, but they start at a low dose, and all the green dots are people that didn't have side effects. They always start at a dose that's low, they think, not, ridiculously low, but in a meaningful dose range, but on the low side where they think they can avoid any side effects. And then they'll enroll a few people, watch them very carefully. Sometimes this is for a month, make sure everyone's okay. And if everyone did okay, they will go up on the dose for the next group of people. This is relevant because sometimes in phase 1 trials, they've filled a group and they're watching them for a month, and so we don't have spots to put more people on. And so this can lead to some confusion and uncertainty if you are considering a trial that is a trial that's trying to determine just the perfect dose to study further. And so sometimes, the trial is quote unquote open at the center, but there are no spots on it right now because we're waiting the people that are currently on it to be watched very, very carefully before they determine the next group of people what dose would they get. Here is in the bigger trials, what I was going to talk about, randomization, which we touched on a little bit. So this is more in the larger phase 2 and phase 3 trials. What is randomization? So it's when you have the whole group of people that are being considered for the trial, and then if they meet all of the criteria, which Kendall's going to talk about a little bit more for joining the trial, patients will get randomized to what treatment they get, and this is done by a computer. Humans don't get to pick. So me as a physician treating a patient in a trial, I don't get to pick because I would have a bias potentially of that, and patients often too, that we probably would pick to try to do the study drug because sometimes that's what we think will work better. But that would introduce bias, right? And so the computer gets to pick this. Another thing to prevent bias is sometimes these are blinded. What does that mean? So they can be single-blinded or double-blinded. And that just means that either the patient or the patient and their treating team do not know which arm they're on, okay? So single-blinded means the patient doesn't know, but the treating team does. That's relatively rare. More often, they're double-blinded, and that neither the patient knows nor the treating team knows. Because if we knew, we would think differently, report things differently, maybe be very optimistic that the study drug is working better than we would otherwise think, or we might, if someone had a side effect, we might have a different theory about what it's from, and it can introduce bias. And so when we treat patients that are on a trial, we keep a very open mind that any symptom someone's having could be from a trial drug, and particularly if we don't know what they're getting or not, we're very, very careful and keep a very open mind. Now, this isn't impossible. It is possible to break the blind if, for example, I think it's important for me to know as the doctor exactly what drug my patient is getting. We can ask the study to tell us if it's important for the safety of the patient. And so, although it's blinded, this is not an irreversible thing, and particularly when it comes to safety, that can be revealed what people are getting. One other point that Kendall reminded me to bring out that is sometimes confusing for people is that some trials can have this thing called crossover, meaning you get assigned to one treatment or the other. Let's say it doesn't work on a set of scans, it appears that the cancer is growing. Some trials will let the patients, usually after a couple weeks, cross over and get the other treatment. So this means like if treatment B here was standard of care chemo and treatment A was an investigational drug, if you were to get assigned to chemo and the scans show growth, it gives you the opportunity to cross over and get the study drug. We touched on placebo. I don't think, for the interest of time, I have much else to say about that right now, but I do want to point out one other important idea about clinical trials is this word equipoise. So when we design a trial, or when we decide we're going to open a trial, or when different groups of people are looking at trials to see if they're ethical or not, it's very important that the clinical trial has the two arms of the clinical trial are in equipoise, or that the investigator has equipoise about them. What that means is that we need to think that treatment A and treatment B here, from everything I know, could be one could be just as good as the other. So it would be unethical for me to make a trial where I know treatment A is going to be better than treatment B ahead of time, because that would be unethical to assign anyone to treatment B. So all clinical trials, when all the people are designing them, they make sure that they are comparing two things here, that from everything we know and all the data we know, either one of these could be better than the other. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't know if I explained that well, but I also bring this up is that clinical trials can get very complicated. These are just some examples, but sometimes it's multiple groups of people getting the same drug. Sometimes it's different diseases with different mutations getting assigned different drugs. Sometimes there's trials that are open for many, many years, and they'll have one treatment arm open, and then over time that one fills up and a new one opens, and then that closes and another one opens, and it can get very, very complicated. And so we can't go through all the possibilities of trial design here, but I bring this up is that it's complicated. If it's confusing, it's not you. It is a very complicated process, and your team and the trial coordinators are there to help you understand the structure of the trials that might be options for you. I list all these words here basically to point out to you all the parts of something called a clinical trial protocol. So this is the rule book every clinical trial has, and it is written before any patient goes on it. And it is very, very detailed. These protocols are usually hundreds of pages long. They have a very defined structure. There's a lot of information that has to be in them. They're there mainly to keep everyone on this trial safe. They're also there that everyone on this trial gets the same treatment, the same tests at the same time, so that the whole point of the trial is that we can get all these people across the country or the world to get the same treatments and the same tests at the same time so that we can actually tell if it worked or not. So number one, this is to keep people safe. The second thing is that we can draw conclusions from the trial, and that the whole point and all the effort and all the trust patients put in us and all of the money that went in back behind the scenes is all worth it, and that we get an answer from the trial. One of those things is that they decide beforehand how they're going to calculate if this trial was successful or not. That's in the statistics. And that is what determines ahead of time how many spots they're going to be on a trial. They only make as many spots as they need to answer the question. A couple other things I'll point out just from the logistics is there are lots of things that get measured on a trial. We've talked a lot about safety. Every symptom that you have if you're on a clinical trial gets recorded by your physician and, importantly, the clinical trial coordinators. In a very standardized way, we grade how quote-unquote severe that side effect is. It's very standardized across all clinical trials, particularly in cancer world. And then your doctor tries to figure out, and sometimes it's hard to tell, is this symptom the patient's having from the treatment? Or is it something else? Do they just have a cold right now? Or is it possibly even from the drug? And it's this recording of symptoms is how that whole long list of side effects ends up eventually in the label of a drug when it gets approved, is that somebody on a trial for the drug had that symptom, and their doctor thought either it definitely was or even possibly could have been related to that drug. And so that all gets recorded behind the scenes. And then there's also, usually with scans in bladder cancer, although in early non-muscle invasive disease, sometimes this is just on cystoscopy and pathology, but we measure, is this working or not? And then two other important things that often go with trials is there's this idea of extra research blood work. So sometimes there's extra blood draws or urine or even sometimes tissue biopsies on trials that are meant to help the investigators figure out how is this drug working or why does it work for some people and not others. And so these are completely for research purposes, but there can be extra samples. Those biopsies are sometimes required for the trial, sometimes they're optional, but you would hear all about that for that trial when you go through the consent process and hear about it. And then finally, more and more, especially, and I think this is very important, there's a lot of surveys that go with clinical trials because they're trying to gather as a patient what your perspective is on the trial, what you're feeling. This is the best way we have of capturing that idea of quality of life, and so a lot of trials have extra surveys with it. I put up this slide just to give you some idea of all the people involved in clinical trials. The most important ones obviously being the patients. In green are the people that you may see and run into at the place that you're getting treatment. So that's clinical research coordinators like Kendall, your treating physician. And then the other investigators at the site are usually other physicians, either at that site or at other places where this trial is open around the country or the world. The other very important group in here is something called the sponsor. A lot of times, that is the drug company that makes the drug these days, but that's not the only person that can run or fund a trial in the US. Sometimes that is what we call cooperative groups in cancer, sometimes, which in particular have a lot of funding from the government. Sometimes that's an individual investigator, sometimes that's a university, but a lot of the ones that we think of in cancer treatment these days are, the sponsor would be the pharma company. It's usually who's helping pay for all the parts of the trial. There's also someone called the medical monitor of a trial. This is a doctor that's not your doctor or at their place, but they oversee the whole trial and they make sure that everyone on the trial is safe, and they're a very wonderful point of contact for both your physician and the sponsor for questions about medically related issues that can come up on the trial. There's also sometimes a group called the Contract Research Organization that sponsors use to help do parts of trials. In gray, I point out some of the logistics side of things. Somebody has to pay for grants. That's sometimes a drug company, but it's also government grants, charitable foundations. A lot of contracts obviously have to be negotiated between all of these different groups of people to make sure things go smoothly. And then very importantly, I have in blue 2 groups of people that make sure that trials are safe beforehand and during a trial. And that's something called an institutional review board. There are ethics boards at every single place that has trials. It's made up of physicians and scientists, but also non-scientists, and always people from the community that review every study before it opens to make sure that it seems ethical and that any risks to patients are minimized. So that's before any trial opens, the Institutional Review Board has to approve it. And then during it, any updates, particularly about any safety issues, get immediately reported to the Institutional Review Board. There's also this group of people called the Data and Safety Monitoring Board that are separate from any other of these groups of people, as you just heard, that are independent from the study, that also monitor a trial when it's going on to make sure that it seems like it's safe and there aren't any safety issues coming up. They can also sometimes end a study early if they think it's either becoming unsafe or if they think it's either so successful or so unsuccessful that it should be stopped early. This is just a pyramid to give you an idea of all the levels of regulation in clinical trials. There's international standards. There's national standards that are mainly enforced by the FDA. Each study, there are many people making sure that all the rules are followed. The sponsors obviously invest in it running well. That medical monitor I mentioned, that separate physician is invested. That independent safety monitoring board. At an institutional level, so in our case at Ohio State, that's our ethics board. We also have a group of physicians that review every trial before it opens to make sure that the science is scientifically sound before it opens. And then at the institutional level, as a patient, your physician and the clinical trial coordinator are on your side. They are there to keep you safe. What I always tell my patients when they're considering a trial is that you don't do a trial for me. You do a trial if you want to do a trial. They're completely voluntary. My job is to make them available to you if you want them. But my main job on a trial is to keep my patients safe on the trial. And so as a doctor treating a patient on a trial, I treat them like I always would. I treat all of their medical issues. And just to keep in mind that my main job is to be their doctor and keep them safe. I also, on that note, tell patients that, clinical trials are voluntary. There are 3 ways that, it's not an irreversible decision, as was pointed out. If you decide to do a trial and you consent to it, at any point you can decide you don't want to be on a trial anymore. At any point, I, as your doctor, if I think it's unsafe or you have a better option, we should be doing something else, I can decide that you shouldn't be on that trial anymore. And then all those groups of people on that last slide, if at any point they think that trial is unsafe, they can also take people off the trial or end the trial. So as my last slide, I'll turn it over to Kendall. I think I've went way over my allotted time. Reasons to consider a trial. So I think, Stephanie commented on this. What trials provide is a treatment option that's not otherwise available. There are options all across the disease spectrum. So from very early disease until very advanced disease, there are trials available in bladder cancer. They're not just there for when people have run out of options, though sometimes those exist as well. But they're there to give you opportunity to have a treatment that you couldn't otherwise get that's not yet approved. It's also a way of helping try to advance the field, right? Every drug that we have now approved in bladder cancer went through clinical trials. And so the only way we can get new and better drugs than we have now is to design very good, careful clinical trials of very good, new, promising drugs to show that they're better than what we do now so that we can get even better drugs approved. I also want to point out that even if a trial is not quote-unquote positive, it didn't show that people lived longer, we still learn a lot from clinical trials. We learn, first of all, that that approach didn't work better, but we also learn from all the extra blood samples and all the biopsies and things about how bladder cancer works and why it does or doesn't respond to treatments. And so we really rely on clinical trials to make advancements for patients with bladder cancer. So I will stop rambling. I'll turn it over to Kendall now, and she'll talk. Let's say you met with your doctor, they recommended a clinical trial. They tell you a little bit about it, why they recommend it. They tell you your other options if you don't do a clinical trial. And let's say you're interested in it. At that point, I would have Kendall or one of her colleagues come and talk to you. And she'll go through what that looks like.
Can you hear me? All right, if you can hear me, clap once. Yeah, okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So like Dr. Collier just mentioned, she kind of went over all of the basics for how a trial is created not just in the US, but internationally, all of the different people who govern that study, and then also just kind of the process and how your doctor thinks about it when they're gonna come and approach you. And then I come in after your doctor has identified you for a study, or once they think that you could potentially be a good candidate. That's where me and my team come in. I'm actually gonna put them on the spot. There are a couple of them here today sitting in the back, so we appreciate their support. And so the purpose of this section is to kind of just give you a roadmap, okay? Say, for instance, you want to participate. What are gonna be some of the processes and some of the things that are required? And then also just kind of going over, items that you may see with us. So I want to start with what is a clinical research coordinator. So what am I? I am the primary liaison between the site and the sponsor. So that means that there are sponsors. Of course, we need a sponsor to fund these studies. So whether that be the government, like Dr. Collier spoke about earlier, or different pharmaceutical companies, someone is paying for this research, right? And so they make this protocol. There's a giant book of rules, basically is what I like to call it. And there are a lot of different trials that we run, specifically at my institution, but across the United States, even specifically for bladder cancer. And so because you guys are already experiencing a really, really difficult time in your life, right? You have a lot of things to think about. You have your family. They created my position. So it's my job to memorize all 500 of those pages so that I can make sure that we're following the rules. And so that's where I come in. I'll catch you at the end.
Just a quick clarification. You two work together.
Absolutely.
So when you refer to clinical trials, you're referring to trials that you're conducting at your university?
Nope. So when we are speaking about clinical trials, even the background that Dr. Collier just spoke about, this is the current landscape and guidelines nationally here. So this is how trials are implemented, both nationally and internationally. That same regulatory board, all of that, those are the steps that we have to make a trial. And then when I'm speaking about clinical research, pretty much every site has clinical research coordinators. I'm a nationally certified clinical research coordinator, so it's like a job that's nationally recognized.
Yeah, I'm sorry, maybe I need to clarify. Doctor, you're participating in clinical trials, specific ones. Maybe you've got 10. But in the US, there might be 100. So you're referring to the 10 that you're working on with your patients that you refer to her, not the other 90.
I think I understand what you mean, yes. So so to participate in a clinical trial, you have to be treated at a place that clinical trials open. So for example, a small phase 1 trial might be open, I'm kind of guessing here, maybe at like 10 or 12 sites around the country. So you would have to be seen as a patient by a doctor at a place that has that trial open. These larger ones, like the phase 3 trials that sometimes have thousands of patients, tend to be open at more places, sometimes hundreds around the country, but yes, you would have to go somewhere that trial is open. I am mostly aware of the trials we have open at OSU. Sometimes I'm aware of trials that are open in nearby areas or other institutions. And we'll talk at the end about how to potentially find places or find trials. But you're right, I can only treat patients on trials that are open at my institution. Yeah, did that answer the question? Okay.
Let me just ask one more question, though, about that. Your trial, you might be the PI if it's an investigator-initiated trial. Like, that means that the doctor, the physician scientist came up with this idea, and they want to put this trial on, and it's usually smaller and in that institution. But you can also be part of a larger trial where there is one principal investigator overall, usually sometimes a small group of experts, and then you're a site, so you're the lead investigator then in that site. So you're managing everything that happens in your facility with Kendall's help, right? Okay,
Yeah.
just want to clarify.
All right, so the primary role of clinical research coordinators is I handle kind of the day-to-day activities. I am involved in trial recruitment, I'm involved in data collection, and I'm involved a lot with safety. And then I just kind of ensure that protocol compliance. So like I said, there's a very large document, there are steps we have to follow, there are rules we have to follow, and I just ensure that we're following all of them for safety. Dr. Collier already spoke about the protocol itself, but I just wanted to emphasize the importance of it. I know that it can be a little frustrating when we have this document and, you know, we want to kind of freestyle is what I call it, and we want to kind of make it for ourselves. But it's really important that we actually have standardization across multiple sites, especially internationally, because how can we say a drug can be applied to multiple people if we allow everyone to have their own standard and their own practices when treating? That creates a safety issue, and so it may seem like you're on a trial and it's a little strict, and there are reasons for that. It's really for safety, and it's honestly for the good of everybody overall. We don't want to waste your time, and we also, you know, want to be sure that we're putting drugs on the market that are actually safe for everyone, okay? So I'll go a little briefly over the trial participation cycle. So you would have already, when you see me, had that initial physician discussion. You normally will meet your clinical research coordinator at what's called the consent visit. So that just means that I'm going to go over some documentation specific to your protocol that you're interested in, and we'll talk about that visit. Then you'll have something called screening, treatment visits. You'll go on to follow-up and then off-study, and I'm going to go into each of these. So we'll start with the consent visit. This visit is a pretty long one, so if you are wondering what to expect this one to be pretty long, okay? A minimum of about 45 minutes to an hour, just because we want to go through the research. We want for you to be able to ask questions. We want for your family members to be able to ask questions. And we really go through kind of the purpose of the study, why researchers are interested in that specific topic. I really talk about some of the obligations. I want you to know up front what we're going to be asking from you, whether that be sampling, whether that be, you need to be here for this amount of days, and after each dose, I may need to see you for a couple of hours after. You can't just go straight home, right? We'll talk about all of that there. We also like to really emphasize the options if participation is declined, meaning just because you see me in the room, especially with this current clinical research landscape, just because you see me does not mean that I am your only option, and you shouldn't have that pressure, okay? So we'll discuss even methods for if you do not want to participate. Your physician will discuss that with you. And then also we'll go over a lot of the risks and benefits, the cost, and then privacy details. And then I just wanted to speak a little bit more about the participation cost, because this can be a bit of a confusing item for everyone. But the information is always clearly listed in your consent form. It is specific to each protocol. So while I would love to be able to sit here and tell you, okay, this is exactly how much you could be expected to spend, or exactly how much would be billed to your insurance, unfortunately, it is all dependent upon who is sponsoring the trial, meaning whether that be government institutions or a pharmaceutical company, and how much was agreed to be covered or paid by that sponsor at the beginning of trial startup. So it is very trial specific, but the consent form does encourage insurance discussion prior to participation. So each clinical trial, when it is created and it's going through all of its checks and balances with the regulatory companies, it is given what's called a national clinical trials number, so the NCT number. And with that number, you are allowed to provide that information to your insurance company ahead of participation. So you don't necessarily have to sign the forms. If you're uncomfortable, you can have that discussion ahead of time. And then, like I mentioned, the amount of items covered are sponsor specific. Okay, so after we do the consent visit, say for instance, you're like, oh, wow, I really want to participate, sign me up, okay? We'll sign that information, and then we'll enter into what's called screening, okay? So the screening visit is important because all participants regardless of the site, anyone participating in that protocol, we have specific minimum standards that you have to meet at study entry, whether that be standards for your blood work, whether that be standards for how much you can do daily. So we call those your ADL. So, can you dress yourself? Can you do all of these items? Everybody has to meet the same standard. At this visit, we'll also review the medical history and your current medication list. Screening also may require collection of certain blood or urine samples, additional imaging, maybe a fresh biopsy, and or samples from old biopsies previously collected, okay? And a huge point here is that some trials may require central sponsor review of the results. This point can be particularly frustrating for patients because it does add a tiny bit of wait time depending on who the sponsor is. So that means that whatever result your hospital may have gotten, whatever we may have said about your disease, this particular sponsor requires a second check by their internal physician that they have designated. So I have to send off all of your information and all of your tissue for them to review, and that does take additional time. So I do want to point out that while some screening periods may be shorter for some trials, some screening periods could have the potential to be a little longer than traditional treatment. So traditionally, if you're not on a study, you could see your doctor one visit and then in 2 weeks you're starting treatment. Whereas on trials, depending on what we have to do to get you on the study, it may be a little longer of a waiting period. And so I do want to kind of let you know that up front. So just some reminders about the screening visit. You are not yet on the study. You are not cleared for treatment. This is a period of time for us to make sure that you meet the standards, but you are not yet a study participant. Abnormal results during this time do not necessarily equal participation rejection. So for example, not everybody has the best blood work, right? Some of us got a little anemia. Sometimes we may have, some low sodium levels or things of that nature. That does not mean that you cannot participate. There are some items that we can treat. So, if you got a little anemia, we may be able to do some iron transfusions or things of that nature, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that because your results are not perfect that you cannot participate. Like I said, we have a minimum level for you to get on the study, and normally those levels are made with the thought that the people participating are ill. So they're not going to be abnormally high or hard to reach, okay? Patient safety is the primary goal for all of our studies. And then in the event that you do have some form of item that would prevent you from participating, rejection does equal redirection. So this is not your only option. There are plenty of other options for you to get treatment, and your physician would be able to discuss that with you. Okay, so now we'll go into treatment visits. Once you've hit the treatment phase, that means that you are actually on the trial, and so you are a participant of that trial. These visits can be inpatient or outpatient, depending on the medication you're getting. So there are some research trials that we have at our site currently that are in the OR. We have some of them where you are required to be admitted inpatient, and then some of them you're just in an outpatient chemo clinic, okay? It's conducted with the treating physician and the research coordinator. We all work closely together to monitor you and to make sure that you're doing okay. The frequency of these visits are determined by the protocol and the treatment regimen. So I can't say how many times you'll get treated or how frequently you'll be at my site. Just know that it's protocol specific. Some of the items that we'll complete at treatment visits, so vitals, lab collections, we'll review your current symptoms to make sure you're not having any adverse reactions to the medication. We'll do a physical exam, probably dispense your medication, and you'll have that treatment. And then a few reminders for the treatment visits. Open communication is mandatory for safety. So we will have some participants, they are scared of being removed from trial, and so they may have had a symptom that they think is unfavorable, and so they won't mention it. And I just want to encourage that open communication across the board. The participant must keep all study appointments. So we recognize that people are humans, not robots. And so, things happen, lives happen, weather conditions happen. But, in order for you to be successful on any treatment regimen, you want to try to be pretty compliant, right? The coordinator has to follow the protocol. So there are going to be some times where the coordinator will hold the medication along with the physician. You might not get treated on a day you thought you were because your lab values were just a little too out of range and we felt like it would make you sick or it wouldn't be in your best interest. And then, like I said, dose holds and delays and modifications are allowed per protocol, and we have extensive guidance on that. Okay, so the follow-up period. This is the post-treatment period. So it starts whenever you end treatment. So whether that be you've completed all of your treatment or you were removed from the study for some reason, it starts when your treatment ends. This can be a safety follow-up, meaning that you're actively still coming in, giving blood work, getting scans, because we're still monitoring you for safety. Or it can be something called long-term follow-up, where basically we're just giving you maybe a phone call on the phone to kind of check in and see how you're doing over time. And the format is determined by the protocol. So finding clinical trials can be tough and a little confusing, but I did want to provide a couple of references. There's clinicaltrials.gov. There's cancer.gov trial guide. I like that reference because you are allowed to kind of enter disease information a little bit. So you can type in, you know, bladder cancer, and then it'll get a little more specific, and you can kind of get better search results there. Patient Advocacy Network, so BCAN mentioned plenty of times that they have that wonderful feature on their website where you can look up clinical trials specific to bladder cancer, which is really nice. And then I also want to encourage academic medical centers around you. So, for example, I know not everyone is from Ohio, but every academic medical center functions very similarly. And so on their website, you'll have some form of area that's kind of find a clinical trial within that hospital. So OSU has a OSU Find a Clinical Trial webpage where it'll link you to myself and my team, and then we're able to do outreach from there. All right, and then we just had some closing thoughts.
I guess I'll try to take a stab. So we just want to summarize. I think we emphasize this, but clinical trials are very important for moving the field forward. Something to consider if you feel comfortable, that they can be complicated, and there are all sorts of different details about all of them, but it's all detailed in the protocol. But you have heard over and over again, the most important thing is patient safety on a clinical trial, and that is what we are all working for. Clinical trial coordinators are your best friend and resource on a clinical trial because they know every detail of that protocol. And then finally, participation on clinical trials is completely voluntary, and it is completely independent of any race, ethnicity, gender, or academic background. They are meant to be reflective of everyone in our country, hopefully, that has a certain disease, in our case, bladder cancer. And so all patients should consider them. I think with that, I'll turn it over. I think with whatever time we have left, we're happy to take any questions.
Yeah, I think we have plenty of time for questions. So where's our microphones? They're coming. Here comes Kira.
Hi, sorry. Now I can ask my question officially, or questions. I have two questions for you. One is, based on your presentation, I'm assuming, which means I could be wrong, that there is a protocol that every trial has to get registered through the government, and that's why sites like cancer.gov are able to index in databases. Is that true?
Correct.
Yep, okay. Every trial in the United States by federal regulation has to be on clinicaltrials.gov.
Now, here's the challenge, at least for me as a patient. My physician may not be aware of trials that might reflect my particular case unless they're going to this database and index and paying ongoing attention to all these new things that are happening. I mean, I'm not a medical scientist. How do I find what's right for me?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and this can be tricky. So you're absolutely right. Not every doctor in the country knows every clinical trial going on. I also have patients on clinical trials. I'm very aware of the ones at Ohio State, aware of some other places, but I also don't know every clinical trial open in the country. And so what I recommend is you ask your team, because they may know, and just have not had time to discuss what was available or not know that you wanted to consider clinical trials. I think good times to bring that up with your treating team is at the time of a new diagnosis, at a time of a treatment change, or if you anticipate that there's going to be a treatment change at some point. Let's say, for example, recurrence at cystoscopy or growth on staging scans. Those are all good times to ask. It's also times, if your team does not know, to think about other places nearby that you could go and get another opinion. And that's very important, is to think of academic medical centers, because they tend to have more clinical trials, but they're not the only places that have clinical trials open. There's very large urology and oncology practices that are not at academic centers that can also have trials. An important thing in thinking about where to go or try to get an opinion to see if they have a clinical trial for you is to think about distance practically, because you have to go to that place to get treatment. And so, you know, if you start thinking of the large places, and it's going to be different for everyone. Are you willing to go 3 hours away? Are you willing to go 30 minutes away? Do you have family in a different city that you would live with for the length of a trial? All these things are very specific to different people and their situation, but you would have to get treated at the place the trial's open. You can also search clinicaltrials.gov. It can get a little technical and confusing, but it does say on there what trials are open. You got to be, so some trials are closed and completed. Those are not worth searching it for, but all the open ones are available on there, and they list there every site in the country where the trial is open. Now, these things change day to day and minute to minute, if a trial's open at a site or not, if there's spots at certain sites or not, and the only way to know is to go to that site near you, meet with a doctor there, and have them screen you for all the trials that they have open. So it can be, it is cumbersome.
Quick follow-up.
Yeah.
If my facility that's treating me is part of the NCI and they're not part of a trial, I find another one a trial that I like that's, say, Sloan Kettering. Mm-hmm. If I bring it to their attention, can they join that trial? Like, can Ohio State join a trial because a patient comes to you and says, hey, this is me?
That's a great question. Essentially, probably no, because the time it takes to open a trial at a site is many, many months. And Kendall can talk to this too. Let's say that you know, an investigator at our institution hears about a great trial. We all decide we want to open it. From that time to the point that it's actually open and gone through the ethics board approvals, all the logistics have been set up, we have the drugs, all of those things get set up. It's usually many months, like 6 months. So that's probably not realistic. To request one be open, although I guess there might be certain situations where it's possible, but probably not. Yeah.
Question over here.
First of all, I want to thank both of you for a great presentation. A lot of interesting information. The question I have is, when you describe the steps from the initial consent visit to actually get into an existing trial, on average, how long does that take from the initial consent visit to actually getting into the trial?
So I can take this one. It's really protocol specific. I would anticipate no less than 3 weeks, honestly. There are some situations where we can move a little faster. There are situations to where if they require some form of review or testing prior to participation that has to be reviewed by that sponsor, it could take weeks. So it could take up to 12 weeks depending on the type of cancer. So for example, if you have muscle invasive cancer, those time from consent to treatment tend to be a little smaller just because the National Cancer Guidelines kind of advocates for that. You can't have too big of a gap. Whereas with non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, it tends to be 8 to 12 weeks. We get a little bit of a gap just because that's kind of the national cancer, that's their standard as well. So we can't really operate outside of that. And so that's why those timelines tend to be a little longer.
I have a couple quick points or questions. One is I love the slide that you had up that said clinical trials and people work trials. But anyway, first my question, out of all the trials worldwide, can you speak to what percentage of those trials are done here in the United States?
That is a really hard thing for me to answer. I'm looking at Dr. Brohard too. The percentage of trials around the world that are done in the U.S., I would say the majority of trials are open somewhere in the United States. Now, there are some that are specific and just open in a particular country. There's some trials that are open only in China. There's some that are open only in Europe. But for the most part, I don't have a good answer for you. I don't have the perspective on that, but I would say the majority of trials that are open are probably open in the United States, well over 50%.
I just want to add that on the clinical trials dashboard that's on bcan.org, we get a feed from clinicaltrials.gov, which can be a little like getting a sip of water from a fire hydrant when you go on there, because they have so much stuff. But we've limited to only those trials that are open and recruiting patients. So they're only trials that are open and available by state and by your diagnosis. And the last time I checked, we had over 500 trials listed on our dashboard. And it's laid out in a way that's a lot easier on the eye, a lot easier to understand, although the content doesn't change from what's on clinicaltrials.gov. And in almost all trials, they identify the Kendall at that institution. So they tell you who is the clinical trial coordinator, and they often give either an email or phone number for somebody to call and inquire. Could I be in this trial? Am I even eligible?
And one thing I'd like to ask, I think there may be some people in this room, but thanks to Beacon, Stephanie may have participated in a consumer review to where when you had the slide up before, you talked about patient involvement, where patients have been involved in approving funding for certain trials, which is a very important thing. We have anyone in here? Carlos, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Which is, if you ever have an opportunity to do that, I would say please go and participate. It is quite an education. First of all, just reading the lay abstract, because you're going to need Dr. Google and a dictionary and everything else. But it's really, really interesting. And I say that because as of Wednesday, I had an opportunity to, I set in on being a consumer reviewer, and then on Wednesday, I actually went to CG Oncology. They have a facility, I hope I say it correctly, it's Biovore, that they're manufacturing a drug that is being approved through the clinical trial process and getting ready to go for approval to the FDA. And I'm mentioning this because I told them that on your behalf, all of us as survivors and patients and caregivers, to thank them for what they're doing, because what they're doing is going to allow a lot of people to keep their bladders and to have a better quality of life.
You brought up a good point, Jim. So for those who are interested in learning more and contributing to research or to even the trial development process, we do have an opportunity as volunteers to help you be part of the research process. And so as you're looking at Beacon volunteer opportunities on the table and everywhere else, our patient advocate reviewers and research reviewers help to contribute, even to the point when people are applying to Beacon for research funding. For some of our awards, we're requiring them to have a letter of support from a patient that they have talked to that said, yeah, this makes good sense. If this is a funded trial and successful, it'll make a huge impact. And so if you're interested in being part of that process, we welcome you as new volunteers to be part of that process going forward, because it's an important part. It should always be patients at the center. So.
Thank you for sharing some terrific information. So my question is, how, what, and when is the emotional support provided throughout the process in a clinical trial?
I can answer that. That was why the clinical research coordinator position was added. So, your physician is going through a lot. Of course, physicians are an amazing emotional support for their patients. But it allows that extra care handoff, right? So I always tell the people on my studies that we're going to become best friends, right? I'm the person you're able to call and contact on the phone when you have a question. You have my email. You have my direct number that comes directly to me. It's not like a automated hospital number that just gives you the directory. It comes straight to me, right? You have a point person to where, okay, I have a question about my appointment, and what time was it, and all of that. So it makes it feel like you're not alone. There's someone there every single time with you. As a clinical research coordinator, I am at every single visit to clear you for that treatment. I am there with the physician. The physician is looking at your labs and your scans and all of that, and I'm there in the room with you. Dr. Collier, we love working with our physicians at OSU because they have really integrated research into their day-to-day practice. And so we are standing in the room with them. We're not in another place. So you are looking at both of us. You are getting information and questions from both of us. And then it's just that consistent contact, right? Whereas Dr. Collier, her caseload is ginormous, right? So we're able to kind of be that point person in that day-to-day. And then also my job is to give you other resources as well. So I'm not sure if anybody was able to do the informational fair, but we have an amazing social work team that is well-versed also in clinical research. I believe at the first booth over here, you met someone named Gabby, and she is a part of our team at OSU. And so it's kind of making sure that we have care from each care team and that we're all speaking the same language together. So I'm able to provide you support with the trial. Gabby may be able to provide you support with, hey, the gas is getting really cumbersome, or what grants or programs do I qualify for participation? And so we kind of all work together along with the guidance of the physician to make sure that you feel extremely supported and that you're not alone, which is really nice.
And I'll just add that when you're on a clinical trial, you have an added level of support compared to when you're not. But what you normally have at your institution is still there. So you still have dietitians or social workers or all the other people that try to help navigate. And you've met a lot of people today on various teams that are there to help you. And those people are still part of your team. You, if anything, get more and get watched even more carefully and have direct line to the research coordinators as well.
We have time for one last question.
It's not so much a question, but some information. I'm Harold. I'm the Bladder Patient Advocate with Swab Cancer Research Network. Dr. Collier mentioned the cooperative groups, and groups like Swab have patient advocates as part of the whole trial development process. And we are championing not only for the number of visits that are involved in the protocols, the timing, trying to really promote a patient-friendly trial that will fit into normal life schedules. And we're also reviewing any patient-facing documents and contributing even to the review of the consent documents so that it's understandable by patients, because we've been through this process ourselves.
Yeah. It's important. So raise your hand if you feel differently about clinical trials now. They are a treatment option. I want to just end my comments before I ask for your comments, but to remind you that without clinical trials, without the dedication of the teams that do the science and the companies that support it and the members of these cooperative groups that come up with these brilliant ideas, we would have very few of the treatments that are approved today. And it's an exciting time, but science needs volunteers. And I think that's really important. So what would you want people to take away from today, Dr. Collier?
I guess my main goal was to really emphasize that clinical trials are very, very carefully designed behind the scenes, and they're there as an option to you if it's right. I also want to emphasize, though, that you should never feel pressured into a clinical trial, okay? But know that there's a lot of people and a lot of thought that goes into them, and they are very, very important for our field, as you've heard. But it can be complicated, and it's not for everyone. But if it's something you're interested in, reach out, ask about them. You know, consider second opinions at large places. Look into them yourself to get some guidance, and we're happy to support you in any way that you'd like.
Thank you. Kendall.
Hi. I think that I would want everyone to know that the trials are designed with you in mind, and we want the results to be applicable to all persons, and so we need a good representation from all persons in each trial. So if you do have the opportunity to participate, and if you feel like it is for you, I would recommend that you join and participate. We'd love to have you, and please use all of your resources, meaning, like I said, your trial coordinators work for you, so if you have the opportunity to interact with us, please do so, and we would love to have you.
So thank you both, and I hope you all got a little bit of information today.